The first warning would not have sounded dramatic. Not on a carrier. Not inside a combat information center built to process chaos. It would have appeared as arithmetic. Too many tracks forming too fast, on too many bearings, with too little time between them. And that is why the most dangerous version of the Abraham Lincoln story is not the viral one. It is not the fake footage of a burning carrier rolling into the sea. AFP later found those clips were AI generated, and U.S. officials publicly denied that the USS Abraham Lincoln had been hit. Iran claimed strikes. CENTCOM said the missiles did not come close. The carrier kept flying missions. But the disciplined question is far more serious than the sensational one. Not, was the carrier sunk? The real question is this. How close can a modern carrier strike group come to disaster when the attack is not built around one miracle weapon, but around saturation itself? Because that is the part people miss. Iran's so-called secret weapon was never just a missile. It was the raid equation. Mass, timing, cost, and pressure. A carrier like USS Abraham Lincoln is a 97,000-ton warship with a deck built to launch power across a region, a ship able to carry up to 90 aircraft and thousands of personnel. In public imagination, that sounds untouchable. In real combat, it is something else, a defended asset with a finite number of radars, a finite number of interceptors, a finite number of simultaneous engagements, and a brutally simple priority list when the sky starts to fill. That is where this story becomes dangerous. And to understand how it nearly could have turned catastrophic, you have to begin after the first launches, not before them. By the time the Abraham Lincoln's watch teams understood the full geometry, the first wave was already committed. Not the heavy punch. The shaping wave. The cheap wave. The wave designed to force decisions before the real killers arrived. One-way attack drones do not need to survive to be useful. They need to exist on scope. They need to be classified. They need to consume attention, screen time, radio traffic, and eventually missiles. A sea-skimming cruise missile does something different. It hides low, compresses reaction time, and makes every second inside the terminal window expensive. Ballistic anti-ship weapons do something else again. They attack the defense vertically, forcing radar, command, and fire control to solve more than one problem at once. That is how you turn an air defense puzzle into a stress fracture. Not by overwhelming the carrier with one weapon. By forcing it to fight in layers until the layers begin to compete with each other. This matters because the public record around Abraham Lincoln already contained the warning signs. In February 2026, U.S. officials said an Iranian drone aggressively approached the carrier in the Arabian Sea, about 500 miles from Iran's coast, and that an F-35C from the Lincoln shot it down in self-defense. Hours later, another U.S. statement described Iranian harassment of a U.S.-flagged tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. That is not just diplomatic friction. That is contact. That is patterning. That is the battle space announcing that distance no longer guarantees comfort. Then came the louder claims. On March 1, Iranian state media said the Abraham Lincoln had been struck, including one claim that 4 ballistic missiles hit the carrier. U.S. Central Command flatly rejected that and said the missiles did not come close. Later, fabricated videos raced across social media showing the ship burning and sinking. They were false. But inside that fog of denial, propaganda, and performative bravado, one operational truth remained intact. If a carrier strike group is forced to absorb a layered salvo near the edge of multiple threat rings, survival is no longer about prestige. It is about prioritization. And prioritization means something very ugly. Something will not get the first interceptor. Picture the scene from the side that has to make those choices. Inside the information center of an escorting destroyer, the air defense battle manager is not looking at a heroic battlefield. He is looking at a shrinking menu of acceptable losses. Track quality firms up. Bearing lines stabilize. Some contacts are almost certainly decoys. Some may be drones. Some may be cruise missiles. A few are too fast, too high, too clean to ignore. Those are the ones that can change the whole fight. He does not get to protect everything. He protects in order. The carrier first. Then the launch deck. Then the escorts that keep the outer shield alive. Then the rest. This is the moral violence of saturation warfare. It is not only destructive. It is selective. It forces human beings to rank what survives. And the first terrifying sign that a raid is working is not impact. It is hesitation. 1 track is ambiguous. 2 are manageable. 16 is a workload. 30 is doctrine under stress. Now add timing. A perfect saturation strike is not a flood. It is an offset. You do not want every inbound arriving together if that makes classification easier. You want enough separation to force repeated decisions, but not enough to let the defense reset. That means one wave appearing just early enough to pull sensors, another arriving low and laterally to complicate geometry, and a final layer timed to exploit whatever the first 2 consumed. This is where the myth of the secret weapon becomes more interesting than the phrase itself. Because the hidden advantage is not exotic metal. It is cost exchange logic. If a defender spends millions to kill objects that cost a fraction of that, and if he has to do it repeatedly under compressed timelines, the attacker begins imposing strategic cost before a single warhead lands. Magazines matter. Reloads matter. Simultaneous engagement ceilings matter. And every commander in modern naval war knows the worst sentence. In the opening minutes of a raid is not, "we are hit." It is, "we are still engaging." Because that means the problem is not over. On the Lincoln, the deck would be a weapon and a vulnerability at the same time. Aircraft on deck, fueling cycles, munitions handling, launch sequencing, parked airframes, exposed crew movement, heat, noise, and sheer complexity, none of that disappears because the ship is powerful. A carrier fights as a system, but it also survives as a surface. That surface is enormous. And it does not need to be sunk to be strategically wounded. A carrier that loses deck rhythm, even temporarily, loses more than steel. It loses sortie generation. It loses tempo. It loses the ability to turn presence into pressure. In regional war, that can be enough to alter everything above and around it. That is why the midpoint of a real saturation engagement is never the dramatic one the public expects. The decisive moment does not come when the first missile is fired. It comes when the defense quietly understands it cannot treat all incoming threats as equal. And that is the realization that changes the Abraham Lincoln story. The question stops being, can we stop the raid? The real question becomes, what must survive this minute so that we can still control the next hour? That is a colder question. A more professional one. And far more frightening. Because once that shift happens, the defense stops trying to win neatly. It starts trying to preserve operational continuity. Keep the flight deck functioning. Keep command and control intact. Keep the radar picture coherent. Keep enough shooters alive to fight the second wave. That last part matters most, because no serious commander assumes the first raid is the only raid. A well-built saturation strike is often a reconnaissance by violence. It exposes emissions, reveals firing doctrine, identifies who shoots first, who holds fire, and which part of the defensive ring reacts hardest under press. In other words, even failure can be useful to the attacker. That is what makes the defense feel hunted. Now move from the destroyer's screens to the airborne layer. The E-2 controller or airborne battle manager is suddenly fighting not just the targets, but the picture itself. Some tracks dip below radar horizon. Some reappear. Some merge. Some separate. Fighters need clean assignment. Surface ships need deconfliction. If the raid includes both decoys and genuine shooters, then the most expensive mistake is not missing the obvious threat. It is wasting the perfect shot on the wrong one. And this is where a carrier battle group can begin to feel the true weight of an anti-access strategy. Not because the defenders are blind. Because they are busy. Busy is dangerous. Busy becomes late. Late becomes leakers. And leakers are the whole point. The cruise missile that survives long enough to reach terminal phase does not need to sink the carrier to change history. It only needs to hit an escort, force a hard maneuver, damage a radar face, crater deck operations with fragments, or trigger enough damage control chaos to slow the air wing. A ballistic threat that compels repeated high-end intercepts has already achieved part of its mission if it strips the defense of depth. Even the drones, if timed well, are not background noise. They are part of the invoice. Everything is designed to create one condition. A defense still standing, but no longer comfortable. That is, nearly destroyed, in modern operational language. Not always a ship at the bottom. Sometimes a ship one engagement away from losing the air war above it. And if you want to know why the response would be merciless, that is your answer. Because once a carrier group survives the opening arithmetic, the retaliation is not emotional. It is systemic. The first priority is not revenge. It is subtraction. Find the launch chain. Find the radar that cued the shot. Find the relay node that CA. Ride targeting updates. Find the drone staging area. Find the coastal launcher, the transporter, the dispersal route, the fuel trucks, the command vans, the signals discipline failures, the pattern that tied the salvo together. Then start erasing them. Public reporting after Iran's claims made one thing unmistakable: even while Tehran was declaring success, U.S. statements insisted the Abraham Lincoln continued flight operations against military targets in Iran. That detail matters more than the propaganda duel around it. Because continued flight operations are not just a rebuttal. They are a message that the carrier did not retreat into self-preservation. It remained a platform for punishment. And punishment from a surviving carrier group is not theatrical. It is cumulative. The first wave of the response goes after what can shoot again soonest. Mobile launchers. Coastal missile batteries. Air defense nodes protecting those batteries. Any ISR architecture that made the raid coherent enough to matter. The second wave goes after endurance. Storage, fuel, repair, reload, communications, and the command nodes that tell the surviving pieces what to do next. That is how Merciless looks in professional warfare. Not loud rhetoric. Not a press release. A methodical stripping away of the enemy's ability to repeat the problem. But there is another layer here, and it is the reason this title still works even after the fake footage is thrown out. Because the more important damage of a saturation raid is not always physical. It is strategic. If Iran, or any regional power, can prove that a U.S. carrier must spend heavily, reposition cautiously, and defend in depth just to remain on station, then it has already achieved a form of deterrent pressure. It has not defeated the carrier. It has taxed it. It has shaped its behavior. It has forced the most expensive navy on earth to respect local density. That is not victory. But it is not nothing. And that is why saturation strike doctrine is so dangerous. It turns weakness into leverage by converting cheap volume into hard choices for a richer opponent. A logistics planner understands this better than anyone. He knows the number that matters is not how many threats were fired. It is how many interceptors were spent, how quickly they can be replaced, how many aircraft had to remain in defense rather than strike, how many escorts absorbed where, and how much operational tempo was traded for local survival. After the smoke clears, the real battle moves to inventory. How many high-end defensive shots did the attackers force? How many do you still have? What does the next week look like now? That is where a tactical scare becomes a strategic consequence. And it is why the Abraham Lincoln story, stripped of rumor and filtered through disciplined analysis, becomes much more than a claim about one ship and one day. It becomes a warning about arithmetic in maritime war. The most lethal anti-carrier concept is often not the weapon that gets the headline. It is the combination that gets through the briefing room. A drone that pulls eyes. A cruise missile that pulls fire. A ballistic threat that pulls doctrine upward. A commander forced to decide in seconds what cannot all be saved. That is the real architecture of danger. And it is exactly why the public gets misled by the wrong images. They want the single fireball. The single hit. The single catastrophic proof. Modern naval combat is crueler than that. It can place a carrier at the edge of operational paralysis without producing the cinematic wreckage social media craves. That is what makes professionals uneasy. Not the fantasy of an invincible weapon. The reality of a smart raid. So did Iran's secret weapon nearly destroy the USS Abraham Lincoln? Not in the fake video sense. Not in the propagandist sense. And not in any confirmed public record that proves the carrier was actually hit. But in the only son. SE that serious planners care about, the answer is much closer to yes than most people are comfortable admitting. Because a well-built saturation strike does not need to sink a carrier to expose how vulnerable even the largest warships become when the defense is forced to solve too many problems at once. And once that exposure happens, the response is always merciless. Not because pride was wounded. Because the math has to be corrected before the next salvo arrives. That is the lesson that outlives the headlines. In modern war, the secret weapon is often not hidden at all. It is the moment a defender realizes he cannot stop everything, only choose what the enemy is allowed to kill first. And if a carrier survives that choice, the retaliation that follows is not vengeance. It is systems warfare, delivered cold, until the side that tried to saturate the shield no longer has enough left to raise a second hand against it.